This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State Extension beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff kicks off today's show discussing weaning options for calves. He also explains what planning is needed and what producers should be prepared for. Sandy Johnson, K-State beef specialist, and John Holman, K-State cropping systems and forage agronomist, continue the show with reminders about prussic acid and the dangers it has for livestock. Ending the show is Wildcat Extension District horticulture agent Jesse Gilmore as he covers 5 steps for saving seed from one year to the next, which can help make gardening have minimal cost. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Thursday show discussing weaning spring-born calves with K-State Extension beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff. A.J., thanks for joining us today.
Always a pleasure to be here.
A.J., as we're thinking about weaning calves, important to do some planning before actually weaning them.
That's a great point. Right now is time to plan ahead. Time to plan ahead. Weaning time, this is fall. Our spring-born calves, we're getting ready. We're going to be we're preparing them for the next transition, right? The transition to go to a grower, to a feedlot, go into the auction barn. Now is kind of an exciting time because there's a lot happening. These calves have been growing with their mom for the last several months. They are ready for that next stage of production, but it's up to us to plan ahead, making sure that we have everything in place, that we're going to prepare these animals for the next stage of production to the best of our abilities.
And what are some of those things that should be in place before weaning?
To me, whenever I start planning out the year, I kind of base everything almost around weaning because that's one of the big periods of time. So what I like to plan for is thinking ahead of how you are going to wean. What is your actual plan for this, both short-term and long-term? Longer term, how long are you going to hold these animals? Okay, so is your plan to wean these animals, have a true maternal separation from mom? Are you going to hold on to them for a period of time that we often refer to as preconditioning? If so, planning today and maybe even starting today with some of the preconditioning programs, right? Getting with your veterinarian. You might have to do some pre-weaning vaccination schedules that would include some modified live vaccines, some multivalent clostridial, and even some of our bacterium products like a Mannheimia. But again, work with your local veterinarian. They'll have those recommendations for you. This also is a great time prior to weaning. We may actually deworm these animals to make sure that we clean out any of those efficiency-robbing internal parasites, that we can clean those calves up and have them prepared for a ration and to be able to gain up to their potentials.
And as we're thinking about this, weaning can be a very stressful time, usually is. Important to make sure your fencing and facilities is ready for that time period.
Facility review, again, back to that short, middle, long-term plan. If you're going to house these animals for any period of time, making sure the facilities, the care, the feed supplies, the water tanks, everything is up to spec. Many times our weaning facility only gets used for a certain period of the year, and it may have been sitting vacant for the last several months. If that's the case, now is the time to get in there, check the water tank, fix anything that might be broken down, check all of our fencing. These are freshly weaned calves, and if anybody's been around a bawling weaned calf, they circle, they try to escape, they try to get away. It's a new area, so making sure that we have our physical facilities up to spec, that we're prepared with feedstuffs, with feed delivery. So if you haven't used your feed wagon in a little while, now's the time to go through, making sure all the belts, everything is up to spec, making sure hydraulic lines aren't leaking. Any and all of those things are ready to go. We have feedstuffs available. Everything's turned on, possibly even working the weaning pen itself. If we need to use bedding, we have those bedding supplies that it's already out, it's packed in, we're ready to go.
And a bunch of different strategies can be used when it comes to weaning. AJ, can you walk us through a few of them?
Yeah, so there's 3 main weaning strategies that are implemented within the industry, and I'm going to throw out a 4th. The first weaning strategy is kind of that hard wean. We, in a single point in time, in one day, we get the whole group together, we separate mom and calf. The mom goes away, the calf stays, or vice versa. But we have a true physical separation. From there on out, that calf is going to be managed with its cohorts, its other calves. So that's what we refer to as hard weaning. Sometimes those animals get on the truck and go straight to the sale barn. Sometimes we'll do a hard wean into a dry lot and begin our preconditioning management. So that's a hard wean. That's a true physical separation. The second one is, now we get into some of our low stress cattle weaning strategies. And what I mean by that is we typically attribute weaning as the most stressful time in a calf's life. If we can minimize those stressors, we can maximize kind of the value of that animal and also maximize its performance once we truly have that weaning. So the first of our kind of low stress weaning strategy is called a fence line wean. The stressors associated with weaning are twofold. One is the maternal calf interaction. Okay, so it's a social stress. When we take mom away, right, and the calf is sitting there, I don't know what to do, and they, have some anxiety, they pace around, they don't know what's going on. This calf is old enough, it can survive on its own, and it should be able to, survive on its own. But it's that separation from mom. No different than dropping kids off at kindergarten for the first time. We don't do a hard wean anymore. Usually we introduce the kids to the teacher. We take them to the classroom. We do all those things to make sure that we have a better outcome. It should be no different with our calves. So that fence line wean is, hey, the calf, we have a good solid structure fence. We can manage that calf. We can feed it separately. It has its own water tank. We introduce it to the bunk, to the water tank. We can do all of those things, but across the fence, it can still see mom. So it's like, oh, okay, maybe I can still smell it. I can still smell her. I can hear her. I can see her. Life isn't too bad. I'm hanging out with my friends in the weaning pen. Life is good. Okay. Now that's fence line weaning. There's also something called a 2-stage wean. And this actually takes a little bit more prior planning, and you will have to run animals through a chute, twice. But what you do is you put in these little nose flaps, and these nose flaps go inside the nostrils of calves, and they can stay in for varying levels of time, sometimes 4 or 5 days, sometimes a week. But really, it's kind of a short-term process where we put the nose flaps in, and it interferes with the ability of the calf to nurse. So essentially, we separate mom from calf nutritionally prior to physically separating them. So it's kind of a cool deal, but it's a 2-stage because you put the clips in, let them go back out into the pasture or the weaning area, and then at a later time you truly separate mom from calf and you pull those nose clips out. So that's a 2-stage wean. And I'd like to throw out a fourth, kind of another low stress strategy, which is really maybe you're not set up to do any of these individually, but anything that you do will be of benefit. And what I mean by that is introduction to the environment. If prior to weaning, if you start feeding your entire herd in that weaning location, so now that the mom brings, mama cow brings the calf into the weaning area, introduces that calf to the water tank, to the feed bunk, to that environment where they feel more connected and more comfortable with that given environment, that's a low-stress strategy. And that's easy to accomplish in a lot of different scenarios. So in my opinion, whether it's introduction to an environment and instead of taking the calf away, take the mom away. So now the calf has already been introduced. It's kind of like dropping the kids off at kindergarten. The mom and parents take the kids to kindergarten class. They introduce them and then the parents leave. That turns out okay because they already were able to get comfortable with that environment. It's the same thing in a weaning pen. So those are the 4 strategies that I think about when we start thinking about weaning.
And when looking through these strategies, producers really just need to pick what works best for their operation?
Truly. And it comes down to how long you're going to keep those animals, what type of facilities you have available, really how many different groups of animals you may have. We have a lot of producers with different groups of, different pastures and a lot of different areas, and you bring them all together. What facilities do you have to be able to handle these animals at different stages of time? So it really, everybody's a little bit different, but those are some options that you can potentially modify to help fit your management scheme.
And even after successful weaning, what do producers still need to do with those calves?
So it's TLC. Okay, these are baby calves just getting ready, first day of class. We need to be prepared. We need to make sure it's comfortable. Okay, long and behold, we're going to have some type of weather event. We're coming into the fall in Kansas, and we need to be realistic that if we get that cold rain, right? Even though, our cows are fine, these calves need some extra care. So whether that means windbreaks, whether that means, different types of bedding that we want to put down, we want to maximize comfort for these calves to minimize any type of stressor that's associated with the weather. Now, when those weather events happen and some of these added stressors of weaning, we need to be prepared for any type of illness. Okay, the most common around weaning is going to be respiratory disease. So having that sit-down communication with your local veterinarian to be able to have the know-how, what animals to treat, when to treat them, and what to treat with is all that pre-planning to be able to have that communication with your veterinarian, have products on hand. So if you find a sick calf today, you don't have to wait 2 or 3 days before you get that treatment in, that you have everything ready, you're prepared, and you can administer that product appropriately as soon as possible to get that calf back on track to its productive life.
So best for producers to walk out through their cattle 2 times a day, more or less than that?
Every interaction with animals, I see that as an opportunity to train them. And sometimes those little calves running around the weaning pen, they're asking for direction. So reminding them a couple times a day where the feed bunk is, where the water tank is, making sure that they're responding to your movements. When they start feeling that repetition, they start feeling a lot more comfortable in their environment, that we can settle them down just by walking through them, making sure we're asking them to move to some of those different locations of the pen. Some of those timid animals that maybe haven't eaten out of the feed bunk. Whenever you move those animals around a couple times a day and you actually ask them to go over to the feed bunk, they'll be more likely to be able to stick their head in that feed bunk and realize, okay, here's where the goodies are. AJ,
I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You're welcome.
That was K-State Extension Beef Veterinarian AJ Tarpoff. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about prussic acid with K-State beef specialist Sandy Johnson and K-State cropping systems and forage agronomist John Holman. Sandy, John, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Glad to be here.
Shelby, always a pleasure.
John, as we're thinking about prussic acid, can you share with us what is it?
Sure. Quite a few different plant species can have what can cause the issue with prussic acid. Some of the plants have lower levels, and we don't really tend to see some issues, but the plants that we normally associate with having potential health risks would be forage sorghum, maybe grazing grain sorghum stalks, sorghum sudan. What it is these plants produce a glucoside, which is the name of that is durin. And when that durin combines with an enzyme, emulsin, then that can be toxic when it's in the animal. And I'll let Sandy talk about the specifics of that. But there are certain conditions that increase the risk or the level of this of the durin in the plant. And we can talk about that if you'd like.
What are some of those conditions, John?
Anything that restricts the growth of the plant, the nitrogen in the plant needs to make proteins. When that does not occur, then the durin can be increased in the plant. So anything that restricts a plant, such as a drought event, soil fertility can impact that. So similar to nitrates, real high soils very high in nitrogen can be a problem, as well as soils that are low in phosphorus, potassium, or sulfur. Sulfur and phosphorus are in particular critical for making protein in the plant, which we need to have quick synthesis of those, so we can not build up those high levels. As well as we're getting to that time of the year that we need to be concerned around a light frost. So during a frost event, the plant leaves are ruptured, and it makes greatly increases the likelihood of having a potential problem if it's being grazed.
And John, as we are cooling down right now, are there any concerns when it comes to freeze events?
When we do get a freeze, that plant, the cells rupture, it does increase the likelihood of a potential risk of the cyanide poisoning or prussic acid poisoning. So what we advise is after a frost to wait 5 to 8 days to let that leaf desiccate, and then that will reduce the risk. The other thing to be mindful of is sometimes our frost events in the fall, we could either get a good hard killing freeze and that'll shut the plant down, or we could get a minor frost event and actually the plant could start to regrow. And that if that's the case and there's new regrowth, then the grower needs to be careful of that new regrowth, because that new regrowth after a frost event could also be high in the Durin concentration.
John, where in the plant usually do we see this issue with prussic acid?
On new growth. So earlier in the year, we need to be mindful on new growth until it is over 18 inches tall. It is in the new, and it's somewhat diluted in the plant. That is higher in the shoots and leaves of the plant. So kind of almost opposite of nitrate, which is towards the base and stalk of the plant. It's the leaves and head of the plant that are highest in prussic acid. And so if cattle are selectively grazing the crop, which that's what they're going to selectively graze first, that is when we can have an increased likelihood of some kind of a toxicity issue.
Sandy, when it comes to livestock, what are the concerns?
Well, what's actually formed when this Durin is activated by an enzyme is cyanide. And so you maybe have heard of cyanide poisoning, which can have very rapid and lethal effects. So depending on the amount, an animal may die quite suddenly. And, in some reports, we've heard of, a producer that rolled out a bale of forage that had subsequently decided had high prussic acid content. And the cows are just dead in this rolled out hay. It's hitting them that quickly as they're consuming it. And so, depending on the concentration and the amount, it's essentially the blood can't carry oxygen. And so brain tissues are not getting oxygen. And just depending on how rapidly that might occur due to the concentration determines whether it's boom, fall over dead, or, they wander around for a few hours, then fall over dead.
Is there anything that is a telltale sign that it's been prussic acid, or you really just walk out and see dead livestock?
Well, typically what you see is dead livestock. If you were watching animals as you, say, turn them on to some new regrowth this time of year, you might see some signs, but, it would be, you have to be there at that time as they're consuming that, a once a day check. You wouldn't typically figure that out. So our best tool really is testing before we turn animals out. And of course, the other thing is with any dietary change is make sure they're not really hungry when they go out. They got something in that room and that's going to dilute whatever they're eating. And that often is an excellent buffer then for any type of problems with whatever this new feed is.
Are there feedstuffs that usually have higher levels than others?
Yes. John mentioned the sorghum family, and, so our forage sorghum, our milo stalks, Sudan grass, things in that family all can have high concentrations of prussic acid. Occasionally we'll hear reports of some other forage, like Bermuda grass was reported as responsible for killing some cattle, and, a lot of Bermuda grass is grazed with no problems, but in this case, whatever combination of soil, fertility, and growth characteristics, there were high levels and the results were unfortunate. So, but generally this sorghum family is what we want to watch out for. And then if we're going to graze something, we need to be aware of, what have been those growth conditions. And if any of those things that John mentioned that's stressing that plant growth, then we want to think about whether or not we should test that forage before we go out. And the same also applies then to forages that we bale up. The dogma has been that once the hay is dried, the prussic acid is totally, this Durin goes away. But if it's really high before it's dried and baled, there can very well be some still in that baled product. And so, you think about the variety of conditions we've had across the state this year, wet dry or dry dry, there's some good chances to have high levels of prussic acid. And so, testing gives you a piece of information and helps you make a decision to manage more safely.
Shelby, I might just add that, the sorghum, grain sorghum, forage sorghum would be the most likely to have high levels. Sudan grass would be on the lower end of risk. As Sandy mentioned, Bermuda would be even less risky than that. Millet does not contain durin, so it would be it would not pose a risk, although millet can pose a risk with nitrates. I'd also like to let listeners know that there is a new variety that's been released of forage sorghum that is durin free, and starting next year, that'll be available that seed should be available for purchase next year. So if a producer is looking to graze and maybe run the risk, there are things we can grow that would have a little lower risk potential.
How does one go about sampling their fields?
So if we're sampling a field that we're going to graze, we want to try and sample the portions of the plant that the animal is going to graze. So we're trying to think like the bovine and what's out there. If there's young regrowth, that's probably going to be attractive. The leaves are going to be more attractive than the stem. So you're trying to mimic that sampling and represent the entire field. It's not just one leaf or one plant. If it's a large piece of ground, I wouldn't want less than 20 different representations of a plant that you're going to mix together. Depending on the volume of that, you may subsample it, but, the sampling method and very, very extensive. The more you do, the better information you'll have. And if it's baled forage, the same general thing applies, and we want to sample each particular field and cutting if that's appropriate. And, again, 15 to 20 core samples from those bales, not a grab sample, but a core sample that goes across all the different layers of that bale is what we want to represent. And we're happy to work with people on sampling method, making sure they have the tools and get enough samples to do that.
That was K-State beef specialist Sandy Johnson, and she was joined by K-State cropping systems and forage agronomist John Holman. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will link an Agronomy E-Update article that talks more about prussic acid as well as nitrate poisoning. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back.
Listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Seed saving is a way to enjoy gardening at a minimal cost. Wildcat Extension District horticulture agent Jesse Gilmore says that most plants produce seeds that can be saved from one year to the next by following 5 primary steps.
So step number 1 is to plan your garden. And anytime I am telling someone how to go about designing a garden, I always tell them your number 1 priority needs to be grow what you enjoy eating. If you enjoy eating the plants that you grow, you are more likely to enjoy saving the seeds as well. And you are more likely to use the seeds once you do save them. Step number 2, control pollination. So pollination is the sexual reproduction between 2 gametes to form an embryo. So to get true to type seed, which is the type of seed that will display the characteristics of the parent plant, you need the 2 gametes to be as close genetically as possible. And if you can get them to be of the same variety, you are going to be much closer to that homogeneous chromosome set than if you were, for example, combining 2 different varieties of the same species together. Your third step is going to be harvesting the seeds once they are ready for harvesting. So when you are choosing plants that you want to produce seed for next year, it pays to think like a plant breeder. You want to select plants for the seed production that are exhibiting the best characteristics for your specific site. If you're wanting tall plants or short plants, if you don't have a ton of space, and you have smaller plants, for example, melons or zucchini, that stay more compact, that would definitely be a characteristic to select for. So you would look at your plants, you would pick the ones that have the smallest size or the biggest fruit, and you would let those go to seed. And that's going to look a little bit different depending on what species of plant you are trying to grow. But in most cases, market maturity, or when you would harvest in order to eat the vegetable, that is not going to be adequate for seed maturity. Your fourth step, I've kind of combined two mini steps into one step here, processing the seeds and drying them. Some seeds will actually dry themselves while still on the plant. This is where beans and peas come into play as some of the easiest, because you just leave them on the plant until the pod cracks in your hand and until you cannot dent the seed with your fingernail anymore. At that point, they will be hard enough to put into storage. Seeds absolutely must be dried before storage. If not, and moisture is included in with the seeds, you're going to potentially introduce mold into the seeds, at which point you would likely need to toss the entire amount of seeds that you have saved, or potentially the seeds will germinate early in the place that you are storing them. Wet seeds will need extra processing. Tomato seeds in particular are ones that will need a little bit of fermentation in order to remove the gel from around the seeds that protect the seed from accidentally sprouting while inside the fruit. That is just one way that plants preserve as many seeds as possible until the right time to send them out into the world and hopefully have them all germinate. Step 5, the last step, storing the seeds. You're going to need a cool, dark, and dry location. Artificial light is typically okay, like in a refrigerator, but sunlight is a no-no. And the reason for that is that some seeds will break dormancy when exposed to sunlight. Basements are typically optimal because they don't allow a ton of sunlight in. When you store them, mason jars are my go-to for storing, but you can store them in plastic bags as well. Opaque envelopes are typically better than plastic bags because you are less likely to let sunlight in. In any case, whatever you put the seeds in, you want to label the seeds with the variety that you have and the date that you harvested them. When you buy seeds from garden centers or nurseries, almost all of the time they will come with an expiration date on the package. That is more for labeling requirements than it is a good indicator of how long the seeds will last. Seeds last longer than their expiration date quite often when they are in the right environment for storage. So you don't necessarily need to rush to use all of the seeds that you harvested in the next year.
That's Wildcat Extension District Horticulture Agent Jesse Gilmore with the 5 steps for seed saving. A full-length webinar featuring Jesse on seed saving is available on the K-State Garden Hour website under Recorded Webinars. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.